When ASUS released the ROG Ally in 2023, it quickly became the benchmark for a Windows handheld gaming PC. It checked a lot of boxes off for a lot of people. It's portable and relatively lightweight. It has a 120Hz refresh rate 1080p screen. The included Armoury Crate games launcher did a pretty good job of hiding Windows. It easily had access to Xbox PC Game Pass, and it was powered by a chip with gaming in mind. For the most part, they hit it out of the park. Except for when they didn't. The micro SD card slot was prone to failure. Mine actually died about a month after my review. The battery life didn't stand a chance against any modern AAA game. We ended up with a huge amount of wasted space because of that proprietary XG mobile port. And as a company, ASUS has a questionable support policy. The one thing they did get right is that they listened to customers, ironically. So now we've got a new Ally, the ROG Ally X. It's got the same Z1 Extreme AMD CPU, but now we have more RAM, a massive battery, and they even fixed some of those engineering decisions. On top of that, I started using my Ally X in a whole new way that has me using the Ally X as my daily driver, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. I mean, this video is basically 2 months late because I can't stop playing games on the Ally X. Let's start with the device itself. The Ally X now comes in black. I think the white shell on the Ally looked really sleek, but when it came to day-to-day usage, the white shell really makes those bezels stand out a lot. The black shell fits the vibe of the device a lot better, and it masks the bezels quite a bit. It's funny to think that MSI basically copied the Ally except made the shell black, and now the Ally kinda looks like the claw. Weird how that works. The Ally X has also seen a slight redesigned shell to improve ergonomics. The shell has rounded edges so they don't dig into your hands as much. I never found the Ally uncomfortable, but I could see the X being a bit more ergonomic now. The slightly redesigned shell does make it so some docks that would perfectly fit the Ally are just simply not compatible with the Ally X. This one I have here works great on my Ally and my Steam Deck, but it's just not right for the Ally X. The USB-C cable is too short and the dock is too thin. The Ally X is also a bit heavier, making it 30 grams heavier than the Steam Deck OLED and a whole 70 grams heavier than the previous year's Ally. This was to make room though for a massive 80 watt-hour battery. This is literally double the battery from the Ally and 1.6 times more capacity than the Steam Deck OLED. So yeah, it's heavier, but I think the promise of more gaming time away from a charger is a win. I'll take more weight for 3 hours of gaming any day. Because of the larger battery, ASUS has also changed the TDP profiles for the Ally X compared to the Ally. On the Ally, your profiles are 10 watts, 15 watts, and 25 watts. On the Ally X, our power profiles are 13 watts, 17 watts, and 25 watts. Both the Ally and Ally X can turbo to 30 watts when plugged in. I found that the Ally X is not as picky about the charger that it allows the turbo mode to be enabled on. This is great because the version of the Ally from last year seems to only want to turbo on the ASUS branded charger. Another change here are the analog sticks. They feel amazing. I liked the analog sticks on the Ally, but on the X, they really take things to a whole new level. They're super snappy, and the contour of the top of the analog stick is inset perfectly. The ABXY buttons feel good and I think are a perfect size, but I do feel like they press down into the shell a bit more compared to the Ally. I haven't experienced any sticky buttons or anything like that so far, but I have read a few complaints on Reddit. We've still got our start and select buttons on either side of the screen, and below each of those is a quick settings toggle and the other will quickly minimize all of your apps. The D-pad is still not something that I love since it's one of those circle D-pads, but it does get the job done and it does feel precise. It just doesn't feel as good to me as a separated D-pad. ASUS does advertise it as an upgraded D-pad capable of 8-way directionals, but compared to the Ally, it feels like they just added diagonal notches on the D-pad itself. The screen is a 120Hz variable refresh rate 1080p screen at 500 nits, same as the previous model, and it does look pretty great. The changes keep going though. At the top of the Ally X has some of the most important changes. The proprietary XG mobile port is gone, and now we have 2 USB-C ports. Both of those ports are capable of power delivery, and one is Thunderbolt 4, so you could even plug in an eGPU. The location of the microSD card has also been moved. This should prevent the slot from spontaneously dying, even though ASUS never fully admitted fault for that. I didn't do anything quite so scientific to test this out, but I do have a fully packed 1TB microSD card loaded up with a huge amount of AAA games. I found that the microSD card slot area never even felt warm. Compared to the Ally, it would get pretty hot to the touch. At the top is also our power button that doubles as a fingerprint sensor. It's actually a little bit inset compared to the Ally, which was flush, and the inset makes it way easier to quickly feel for the power button to log in. Lastly, the Ally X refreshes the back of the device too. The biggest changes here are the smaller macro buttons. They're kind of chunky, but they take up less overall area. I personally prefer this because I don't really like macro buttons. They just get in the way of comfort for me, or I just fidget with them. If you are somebody that does like macro buttons though, I don't think the smaller ones will bother you. They're easy to press and they're easy to reach for. Software-wise, we're not really going to spend a lot of time here. The Windows setup is long and drawn out, and it even has some extra steps to get into ASUS's mailing lists too, because we definitely want that, right? After some lengthy Windows updates followed by lengthy ASUS updates, you're finally ready to install games. ASUS has their Armoury Crate software that acts as a unified games launcher. It's received a bunch of updates since its initial launch and has turned into a fairly refined experience. It's snappy, easy to navigate, and also pretty reliable about finding all of your games, even if they're on your microSD card. The shortcut key to quickly adjust settings on the Ally X gets you right into the settings you would want to change on the fly. I really mostly use this for TDP control or display brightness, but you can control this a bit more in Armoury Crate. There's also settings to display real-time monitoring for FPS and battery percent. In the Armoury Crate settings, you can have more nuanced control over your TDP, fan curve, adjusting the VRAM, and changing the behavior of the RGB lights on the analog sticks. But other than that, it's Windows. Microsoft does seem to be dipping its toes into the handheld segment of users lately with the preview release of a compact version of Game Bar. It's supposed to make the experience more controller-friendly, but I found it pretty underwhelming. It's like a pseudo launcher, but it's just not fully baked. It's a bit clunky and really just doesn't do a whole lot yet. Hopefully this is just them setting up the groundwork for a handheld edition of Windows or something cool like that. While I do think ASUS does a pretty good job with Armoury Crate, I can't help but feel that because of Windows, I'm leaving some gaming performance on the table with all of its bloat. I think for me, the best possible experience would be if I can get SteamOS on the Ally X. And you know what? That's pretty much exactly what we can do. Bazzite is a version of Linux designed to replicate SteamOS, since SteamOS is not yet open sourced. This ended up setting the Ally X apart from other devices for me. A perfect operating system paired with some really great hardware. The perfect balance. There's a bit of work to get there, but I'm telling you, it's actually game-changing. Not only did I install Bazzite for that SteamOS experience, but I'm actually dual booting into Windows as well. This means that whatever doesn't work on SteamOS, like Call of Duty because of its anti-cheat engine, it can still work perfectly fine on my Ally X because we can just dual boot into Windows. The whole process of getting Bazzite installed really only took about 30 minutes or so. There's a bunch of steps to follow, and luckily the documentation from Bazzite is excellent. But if you're a visual learner, Retro Game Core recently released a guide that will help you get everything set up in no time. You definitely need a keyboard and mouse for this process though. But basically, once you get used to navigating through the BIOS, you've gotten through the hard stuff. Bazzite has a super easy install process, and it even helps you install extra tools like Discord, different web browsers, and even EmuDeck. Bazzite also includes a collection of tools and software that makes the Ally experience seamless. The left button toggles the Steam menu and the right button toggles the settings panel, just like you'd expect. If you double-click the right button, you actually get another layer of controls that all work with the Ally out of the box. This is made possible by Handheld Daemon? I've never said that word out loud. Anyway, there's RGB controls for the analog sticks, nuanced TDP controls, and there's also advanced settings like swipe gestures, controller settings, and some touchscreen settings. I used a 1TB microSD card to store pretty much all of my games. This way, I could share my Steam library between my SteamOS setup and my Windows setup. Install once and use everywhere. As great as my experience of dual booting has been, there are some small caveats I found that are worth calling out. First is just the value of having a high-speed microSD card. I used a standard 1TB microSD card at first, and I was getting pretty long loading times in games. Sometimes, games like Spider-Man would just totally stop mid-game and have a long loading spinner too. Once I switched to a high-speed microSD card, I instantly had a better gaming experience. Initial load times maybe felt a little bit longer than normal, but I never experienced any skips or lags or any more like mid-game loading after that. Another thing to consider with my setup is that Bazite's documentation actually recommends against formatting your microSD card as NTFS or exFAT. I honestly ignored that because that would have prevented me from sharing my games between Windows and SteamOS. I would also sometimes get weird disk write errors, but I was able to fix that just by changing my version of Proton from experimental to the latest version. One last quirk I found was that sleep mode was actually kind of game-breaking. It seems to work at first. Just tap the power button and you're good. Waking up from sleep is also seamless and pretty quick too, but every time my device powers back on, I wouldn't be able to use my controller in the game that I had open. Even the Steam overlay is missing the top status bar. The only way I've been able to fix this is through a full system reboot, so that kind of kills the sleep mode for me, but I'm expecting that I can do a software update to fix this eventually. Dual booting on the Ally X is pretty straightforward. When you feel like playing a game that needs Windows, just reboot your device, button mash volume down, and then press the left action button and select Windows. Now you can easily access games through GOG or Ubisoft Connect. You can get a lot of these games to work on the Linux side, but there's a bit of tinkering, and I'd prefer to just jump right into a game. Call of Duty is the best example here though. It has an anti-cheat that's just simply not compatible with SteamOS. But boot into Windows, start up Call of Duty, and you're good to go. If you're feeling left out about Bazite, you can actually probably pretty easily install it on your device too. They have custom images made for specific devices. This includes the Legion Go, GPD devices, Ein devices, and even specific builds of laptops. If the device you have isn't on their list of custom-made images, this just means that you might have to take a few extra steps to get everything working perfectly. But since it's just Linux, you can choose to tinker with the setup to your heart's content. So now that we've got the perfect device set up, let's get into some gaming. With 1.5 times the RAM, we're going to see more steady gameplay experiences overall in both Bazite and Windows. In general, I found that you're going to see just about the same performance for games that are supporting both operating systems. The only settings that I've changed out of the box for gaming was to bump up the RAM assigned to the GPU. You can do this in Armory Crate. Mine was set to 8GB by default, but it says 4 should have been the default. Either way, I decided to bump mine up to 10GB. I'm also playing all of these games at 25 watts TDP. Starting with Cyberpunk, it's always a great benchmark to start with, and when we have it set to the Steam Deck preset at 1080p and change FSR to prioritize quality, we get really great benchmarks. Spider-Man at 1080p medium settings is also a great demonstration of this device's power. Despite turning up the graphical fidelity, we can still see our battery life estimation is really great. The Last of Us at medium settings also looks really great here. Older games like Grand Theft Auto 5 are no problem for the Ally X, and they can hit relatively high frame rates too. Or Persona 4 is another great example of a game that's awesome on the Ally X. It's not super graphically intensive, but you can limit your TDP or frame rate to get extended battery life. Then we have games that are only going to work on the Windows side of things, something like Star Wars Outlaws. So when we boot into Windows, we can start up that game no problem. I did have fairly mixed results with the game, barely able to get a steady 30 FPS. But once I did set the game to run at 720p, it actually ran pretty great, and I was even able to bump up those settings to medium. It's not the best looking, but hey, this is one of the newest AAA games, and it's running on a handheld without a dedicated GPU. Kind of crazy. And then of course, there are the easier to run games that are awesome on the Ally X because you can really take advantage of those high frame rates. You could even turn down the TDP a bit and get even better battery life. Cult of the Lamb has such a great vibrant art style and it shines on the Ally X. I've also found myself just completely sucked into games of Balatro on the Ally X, because I can just play for hours without even thinking about the battery life. And let's not forget about emulation. The Ally from last year was already pretty good with emulation, and that continues on the ASUS ROG Ally X2 on both Windows and Bazite. My main goal with emulation, just like with my PC games, was to make sure that I can share my library between both Windows and Bazite. There's a lot of ways to go about this. Whether you use EmuDeck, RetroDeck, or RetroBat, you don't have to stick to the same options across Windows and SteamOS. I do like that EmuDeck was really easy to set up and integrated right into Steam, but you'll always run into quirks. Mine was not being able to launch 360 games through Emulation Station on Bazite, but that doesn't impact the insanely good performance we're going to see on the Ally X. GameCube can handle literally anything you throw at it. Enable your widescreen hacks and upscale to 1080p, and you're going to get a great GameCube emulation experience. All of my testing was at 25-watt TDP, but you can even lower your TDP in some cases to really push the battery life a lot farther. PlayStation 2 is also not a problem here at all. Burnout is a great demo of emulation here, but also it's just a great game, and I'd literally do anything for EA to make another Burnout game that's not Burnout Paradise. I want a real, classic Burnout game. Come on, EA. PlayStation 3 is also surprisingly good depending on the game that you're trying to run. I like the idea of finding games that are locked to PS3 still, so I got Infamous up and running because I've always wanted to play it. It ran really great. There were some minor stutters here and there, but it was often running over 40 frames per second. Over time, the stutter smoothed out from the shader compilation and actually played really well. Xbox 360 can get up and running, but from my experience, the game library is a little hit or miss. I wasn't able to get Red Dead Redemption to run at full speed. And I tried out Spider-Man Web of Shadows, which had moments of running fine, but often was well below 30 FPS. I also tried out the Deadpool game, which actually just ended up crashing pretty much right away. Wii U is a very optimized emulation experience, and that translates really well to the Ally X. Games like Wind Waker HD or Twilight Princess HD look incredible and play full speed, no problem. Sticking to the Zelda theme, of course we'd have to take a look at Breath of the Wild. Not only does it run really well on the Ally X, but you can even use mods to push the capabilities of the game even farther. Switch emulation is a bit power hungry, but you can definitely get games up and running full speed. I found that old builds of Yuzu performed a lot better than even the latest versions of Ryujinx. But I'd say it's best to experiment with settings and trying the same game between both emulators to see where you get the best results. But a great example of a game perfect to play through Switch emulation is Red Dead Redemption. It didn't work very well through 360 emulation, but the Switch performance is much better. Considering it's a game that's not natively available on PC, this is a great way to play the game. You can obviously play some classic systems here as well, but when you get to D-pad centric games, I'm just not a massive fan of how it feels. But performance-wise, it's going to be perfect. One aspect that I think's worth a conversation is just ASUS as a company. ASUS has been in some hot water for a while about their customer service practices. When you invest $800 into a product from a large corporation, you expect them to stand behind it. It seems that's not always the case. ASUS has committed to improving their practices, but only time will tell. Hopefully you won't have to test it out yourself. I unfortunately ended up in a weird loop trying to get my Ally fixed last year. It ended up being too much of a hassle, and I just opted to upgrade the 1TB drive instead of coordinating sending the device to ASUS. One of the best things about these handhelds is that their rise in popularity means that big box stores are carrying them. The ROG Ally, the Ally X, the Legion Go, and now even a few Neo devices are being carried by Best Buy. This is a great way to ensure that you're in a position to either use your credit card's extended warranty features, buy an extended warranty from Best Buy, or just have the peace of mind that you could easily return the device within the store's policies. I personally approach it the same as buying something like an AOK Zoe, a 1X player, or even an Ein. They could crap out after 366 days, and I just might not be able to get support from them. This is maybe my jaded view because I've only experienced a positive support experience with Apple and their Genius Bar. So yes, there's definitely glaring issues with ASUS's policies, but also they're not alone, and it's definitely something to consider when picking up one of these devices. Overall, I've had an awesome experience with the Ally X. That being said, everything I did in this video could pretty much be accomplished on the original Ally released last year as well. In fact, you might find some really good deals on last year's model too. If you already have an Ally, I think it's hard to justify an upgrade unless you're able to offset the cost difference by selling it. Best Buy is offering a discount of up to $230 when you trade in your old Ally. That would at least bring the Ally X down to a price of about $570. But I would imagine that you could probably sell your Ally for more on eBay or something like that. Or maybe you're just mega rich. Then heck yeah, get this. I'm sure we'll get a true next generation Ally soon enough. AMD has already started talking about the Z2 Extreme recently anyway. So if you're watching this feeling buyer's remorse or anything like that, I don't think you need to go that far. But also, don't get me wrong. If you're in the market for a handheld gaming PC, the Ally X is a top tier choice, and it's going to be my recommendation alongside considering a Steam Deck. But when you account for the Ally X's 24GB of RAM, a huge battery, dual USB-C ports, and re-engineered for better hardware stability, it really makes the Ally X the definitive Windows handheld gaming PC for me. Add on top of those hardware improvements the SteamOS experience through Bazzite, and we really get the best of both worlds through dual booting. The Ally X has become my primary handheld gaming device since the end of July, and it's going to stay that way for quite a while. But those are just my thoughts. What do you think of the Ally X? Is it worth an upgrade? Do you prefer a different handheld? How about Bazzite? Are you considering dual booting SteamOS and Windows? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Make sure you're subscribed or give me a follow on Twitch so you don't miss future reviews and unboxings. And thanks for watching. It's back to Persona for me. I'm kind of obsessed with that game.